Hi, everyone. We're going to be getting started in just 1 minute, so please come in and take a seat, and feel free to bring your lunch. Thank you.
All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. My name is Maureen Conway to our conversation in our Opportunity in America series, Measure What Matters, Realigning Measures of Economic Success with Societal Well-Being. The Economic Opportunities Program works to advance promising policies, strategies, and ideas to help low and moderate income people in the United States connect to opportunity and thrive in a changing economy. And as part of our work, we host the Opportunity in America series to really bring together a variety of voices around what's happening for ordinary people in today's economy. We bring together researchers, policymakers, business leaders, labor leaders, philanthropy leaders, and more to discuss particular issues and to talk about the challenges facing people and ideas for change. And today's conversation on measures, I think is a really important and timely one. Most of the measures we keep hearing about in the news regarding our economy indicates it's doing pretty well. The stock market is reaching new highs, unemployment is low, GDP continues to grow, and but it seems like also when you read the news, these numbers don't necessarily reflect the reality that many families in the United States are facing. Families who are dealing with stagnant wages, rising expenses, and particularly limited opportunities to get ahead. So why do our measures of economic health seem kind of disconnected from people's sense of economic well-being? Do these measures provide adequate information and guidance for policymakers, for business leaders? How do they inform consumers, workers, and voters about how they think about the economy, and how do they influence people's behavior? As a saying goes that we're fond of in the Economic Opportunities Program, what gets measured gets managed. So do we need some new measures to kind of direct our attention to what needs to be managed in today's economy? So today we'll talk about inequality and our economic divides, what we know, what we need to know. One thing we do know is that economic opportunities are not evenly distributed. Race, ethnicity, gender, and geography play an outsized influence in the experiences of individuals and families in the United States. And these economic divides and how they cut across the issues of race, gender, and place, they've been a long concern and something that we focus on in the Economic Opportunities Program. But it's not just our program that thinks about them. We share this with many others working in the Aspen Institute. And I just want to recognize that in organizing today's event, we worked with our colleagues in the Ascend program, the financial security program, and the program on philanthropy and social innovation here at the Aspen Institute. And I'm just really deeply grateful to my colleagues for their partnership and support as we thought about today's event and as we think about so much of the work we do here at the Aspen Institute. All of us are really excited to bring together this group of experts to talk about how to measure our economy and economic health and how to address our economic divides and build an inclusive economy. As I mentioned, this conversation is part of our Opportunity in America series. We are extremely grateful to the Ford Foundation, Walmart.org, Prudential Financial, and the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth for their support of this series. We could not do it without their support. Now, I do want to remind people that we are live streaming today's event, so please, if you have your phone with you, please do silence it, but please do also join the conversation on Twitter. Our hashtag is talk good jobs. No, it's not. Our hashtag is talk opportunity. Okay, so today's event is in 3 parts. We'll begin with a opening presentation from Heather Boucher on her most recent book. Here it is, Unbound: How Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. If you haven't seen it, if you haven't bought it, do so. I encourage you to read it. It's a very readable, accessible book that summarizes an amazing amount of research and really makes that just come alive. So I encourage you to buy it. You'll learn a lot. I did. So after we hear from Heather, we're going to have a panel conversation, and Heather will be joined by Sapna Mehta from Groundwork Collaborative and Daniel Alpert from Westwood Capital. And then we'll be sure to leave some time for question and answer from all of you. We really wanted to engage you in the conversation. And for people live streaming, you can also tweet questions using the hashtag #TalkOpportunity. And now it's just my pleasure to introduce Heather Boucher, co-founder, president, CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Heather is a brilliant economist, author, influential leader in economic policy, and has built an important organization here in DC. But one of the things I also just want to mention is not only has Heather done amazing research and writing herself, but she's really directed research and really built a community of scholars that are focused on this issue of inequality, and really built an important body of scholarship and an important community of voices that are talking about it and thinking about it and driving to new solutions to address this problem. So I just want to give her credit for that, because it's really quite remarkable what Heather's accomplished. And so please join me in welcoming Heather Boucher.
That was a lovely tour. Thank you, and I'm so glad that you talked about the community we're building at Equitable Growth. What I'm going to talk about for a few minutes about this new book that came out in October is really the learning that the organization that I launched with many other people in November of 2013, what we've learned from it over the past 6 years about the new research evidence about whether and how inequality affects our economy. And I'm going to end with some policy recommendations that go direct to this question that Maureen kind of asked us about, whether or not we need new measures. And I think the resounding conclusion of the research we've been doing, and one of the key conclusions of my book, is yes, please, we need new measures. And I'm going to give you a bit of a preview of my favorite new measure that we've been working hard on at Equitable Growth. So I'm going to try to stick to just a few minutes here. I'm very excited to share this research, and sometimes I get a little wrapped up in talking about different pieces and then realize that I've gone on too long. And then the more that you look at me and look like you're really fascinated, the longer I'll talk. So if you get bored, just feel free to start looking down or like you're falling asleep, and I'll stop talking. It's actually quite good. Also, just fun fact, talking to senators is the best audience ever, because they all look like they're madly in love with you, and they're like so wrapped in everything you're saying, even though I'm sure they're not even thinking about what you're talking. Maybe they are. But just noting, we should all strive for that. So at Equitable Growth, we seek to understand whether and how economic inequality in all of its forms affects economic growth and stability. And we seek to use that research to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies so that we can have an economy where growth is strong, stable, and broadly shared. And we've been doing this, as Maureen said, through funding research and engaging a community of scholars. Over the past 6 years, we've given away over $5.5 million to over 200 scholars nationwide. And as we've been looking at the research and evidence coming from economics and coming from across other social sciences, we've come to a few conclusions. And that's what I want to talk for a few minutes with you about today. One is that due to the fact that researchers now have access to so much data that they didn't have access to 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, the profession, economic research, is much more empirically grounded and scholars are much better able to evaluate questions of what we as researchers would call heterogeneity, what lay people would call just differences across or within groups, much more able to look at that because we have the data and we have the computing power and we have methods that allow us to show causality. So there's been a lot of sort of technological reasons why things have changed in economics. Once you start looking at this data and evidence, it becomes clear that, at least in my view and the view of my colleagues at Equitable Growth, that economics is in the middle of what I think is a paradigm shift. There are a lot of scholars who are sort of in the very classic Thomas Kuhnian sense, are finding things that are sort of at the boundaries of the accepted realm of scientific inquiry that aren't consistent with our prior theoretical understanding of what makes the economy grow, what's going to create the kinds of economic outcomes that we want. And so it's an incredibly exciting time in economics. I feel like it is the most exciting time in my career because there are so many things that are coming out that really are making us question our prior assumptions. And the book is really a culmination of our learning about this. So I want to just start, and I know here in DC, a lot of you know about the data. I'm going to spend a couple minutes just looking at some of the grounding data about inequality to make sure we're all on the same page for the whole conversation we're going to have over the next hour, an hour and a half. A little bit about what we're learning from the evidence, and then a little bit on policy recommendations. I do want to get right to the spoiler alert on the policy recommendations, so you can have this in your head as I'm going through what I'm about to say. Once you start looking at the research and evidence, it becomes clear that unless we think about policies that constrain inequality at the very top and provide ways that you create counterweights to the ways that concentrated economic power looks like in the economy and the ways that it translates into social and political power, unless you do both of those things, you are not going to undo the constricting and downward pull of inequality on economic outcomes. So that is sort of the meta framework that I think we should be thinking about policy moving forward. So with that, let me just go through a few economic, just a couple of slides here. So first, I'm going to show, and this is all based in the United States, and these are supposed to be emblematic, so don't get too hung up on the details. Happy to send the slides, happy to show you the papers. None of the research in the book is my own research, so I'm not totally attached to any single study and may not know all the ins and outs of it, but really it's showing sort of what we're learning from economics. So this first figure is from research by Piketty, Sias, and Zuckman, looking at the income distribution in the United States. This is the decades of the 60s and 70s, so from 1963 to 79. On the x-axis is the income distribution in the United States. On the y-axis is income growth. And the purple line is average national income growth. And so national income in the national income and product accounts is virtually the same thing conceptually to, or for these purposes, to gross domestic product. So when I say national income, you can kind of think of, oh, that's the measure of what we're making, the incomes that are earned in our economy. So what this shows you is in those decades of the 60s and 70s, we were a country that was growing together. We were also a country where when essentially GDP, national income, grew over the course of a year or a quarter, the vast majority of Americans benefited from that growth at about the same rate. So about 2/3 of people saw their incomes grow within about 10% of the average over these decades. And low-income people saw their incomes grow faster than the average, and high-income people saw their incomes grow slower. So if you listened to the news reports and you heard that GDP was 3% back in 1969, you would be able to know that, wow, okay, 3%. That means low-income people were seeing growth of maybe a little bit more, maybe 4%. High-income people seeing growth a little less. But most of us all had our incomes growing at about 3%. We were growing together. There have been a number of significant changes in the data and evidence since these decades. The first, and this one we do not talk about enough, national income is slower. So when you go and you think about the decades from 1963 to 79, average national income growth was 1.7%. Since 1980, it's only 1.3%. And so as you're going about your day and your work and you're thinking about policy, I strongly encourage you to start with the question, why would growth be slower than it was in earlier decades? That should be our starting point. Rather than what have we been doing so right in the economy, there should be some questions about what were we doing right before that we aren't doing now. or what have we changed since 1980? There's some hints there in what I'm saying, but that we can talk about that in the Q&A. So there's two other big changes on the income side. So this chart is 1980 to 2016. You can see it's a very different picture. First, we are a nation that is growing apart. When the economy grows, lowest income people see the smallest amount of growth, and high income people see the highest amount of growth. We're literally growing apart. And it's extreme growth at the very top. And then second, the average now means virtually nothing. Because if you hear that GDP in the fourth quarter of 2019 was 3%, or whatever it is, we'll just say 3%, what that really means, if it were 3%, is that the top 10% of people saw their incomes grow by a lot more than 3%, 5, 6, maybe 10%, and everybody else saw their incomes grow by something less than that. So now when we get that data, and the National Income and Product Account data that gives us the GDP, it's data that was compiled in the 1930s. We adopted GDP as an international indicator really when the OECD was founded in the 1960s, and we all across countries started looking at it. It doesn't mean anything anymore. It's not telling us anything useful about the economy if you actually care about what the economy looks like across a society. And that's very, very different than in decades past. There's so many other ways to look at this change in what's happened across the United States. We are a nation with much less upward mobility. Used to be the case if you're born, in the 1940s or so, 9 out of 10 people grew up to out-earn their parents. Among those born in the early 80s, only about half of them are now out-earning their parents, and those trends are going down. I'm sure it's less than half now once we start getting data for more recent cohorts. Alongside high income inequality, we're seeing high wealth inequality. Families at the very top have seen their incomes grow by almost 300% since 1989, while families in the bottom half, their wealth is just back to where it was in 1989. No increase in their wealth for the bottom half of the US, and in no small part that's due to the financial crisis. But it's also a long-term stagnation in the trends. And then the other inequality trend that is intimately connected to the trends on income and on wealth and mobility is the fact that we are a nation where we have an increasing economic concentration across firms. This affects the rents that people at the very top of the income and wealth ladders experience as concentration affects equity prices and dividend payouts and the rents that are experienced in those monopolies. It's also a factor that is pulling down wages. And there's a lot of new empirical research that shows that this high concentration we have now is actually lowering investment in the United States, or is a culprit behind lower investment, which then means we don't have the productivity growth, which means that we don't have the bandwidth for the kind of wage growth that we would like to see. So the rising economic concentration across firms is intricately connected to this and is also something that we need to start thinking about in our stories about inequality and how we're measuring economic success. So at Equitable Growth, what we've been doing is saying, okay, so we have all these different trends in inequality. So what does it mean? How do we understand how this should change our understanding of the economy? Is this something we should worry about? Or is it just, this is sort of the natural state of affairs? Why should we care if people at the very, very top are getting these high incomes? Maybe they're just investing it and that's improving productivity for all, which I just sort of said maybe it's probably not. That's a hint. Or maybe we shouldn't care, right? Are there economic reasons to care above and beyond fairness? And so our research program for 6 years has been dedicated to understanding that question. And what I do in the book is I summarize, and I try to think, I hope that I have done it in a way that doesn't really feel like a literature review. In each chapter, I take an economist or a scholar whose research is emblematic of what we have been learning. I interviewed them, so there's some pithy quotes from them, and really tell the story of what we're learning from the most cutting edge research about how inequality is constricting growth. So that really is the headline there. And there's 3 ways that we see inequality affecting growth. First, the easiest for us to wrap our heads around, I dare say here at Aspen, where I know you have a lot of different programs that think about this issue, this is a yes, well, we know that, right? We know that higher inequality means that some children don't have opportunities because of the neighborhood they live in, because of the schools they go to, because of the fact that they don't have access to early childhood education or pre-K, or maybe they grew up in a neighborhood that is exposed to a lot of air pollution because they live near a highway, and this is affecting fetal development, and that is affecting lifetime employment and earnings and outcomes. There's all of this rich bodies of research and evidence that shows the way that inequality is affecting both the development of human capital and the deployment of human capital. Just one study that I think, to my mind, really illustrates this very vividly on the deployment side is the research, and we helped fund this work. And Raj Chetty was a founding member of our steering committee. He and his colleagues wanted to understand what drives innovation in America, who becomes an innovator, and because that is really what drives growth, right? Ultimately, it is sort of the new ideas and the deployment of talent and those ideas into the economy that's going to propel an economy forward. So I wanted to understand the effect of inequality on this. So they got data on all the people who applied for and received a patent, and they knew about that person's income and employment outcomes as an adult. And they matched that data to those people's third grade test scores and the people's income and demographics when they were in third grade. So now they had a measure, an independent measure of somebody's aptitude for becoming an innovator. Or so, so they wanted to sort of test that. So the first thing they do is they said, okay, what does this look like? And they found that kids that do really, really well, that score on the highest part of the distribution on third grade math standardized tests, are much more likely to grow up and get a patent and become an inventor. And totally, that seems to me like a common sense finding, but they were able to show that. Okay, so now you know like what kinds of people are likely in general to grow up and become an innovator. And so they just look at the kids that scored the highest on those third grade math test scores. And they found that kids from the highest income backgrounds, 4 times as likely than other children to grow up and become an innovator. And so they call this paper the Lost Einsteins, because they are documenting that our economy is being dragged down by the lack of innovation and the productivity gains that would be bringing, because there are all of these children who somewhere along the way are denied the opportunity to find a job that provides them with the best fit in the economy and to contribute in the economy and to become an innovator. And this isn't just about the fairness for that child and that child's trajectory. It also means that there are lots of things that are not being invented that would serve different consumer groups, right? One might hypothesize that people in low-income or moderate-income communities might invent different things, right? They might have different things that they think are important to their communities or different ideas that they would want to invent. It might be the case that women would invent different things than men. It might be the case that Black and Hispanic people would say, oh, I've got different things I want to invent that serve my community or tap into my life experiences. So we actually then have this diminishment in the kinds of goods and services that are available in the economy because we've cut off that flow of ideas, which is another way that it drags down our economy. So to my mind, this study really sort of encapsulates it, but I wanted to stress this is just one of literally hundreds, if not thousands, of research data points that together really lead to this conclusion that inequality is obstructing the supply of people and ideas into the economy. The second way that we see inequality affecting growth is through subverting the institutions that manage the market, making our political system dysfunctional and our markets ineffective. I think I actually just switched those from the slide there. You can see this, throughout the economy. You think about what happened in 2017 with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Poll after poll shows that the American public would like to see us as a country doing more investment in things like public education or infrastructure or just public investment more generally. Yet we are not doing that. And in fact, in the United States, our tax revenue as a share of GDP has fallen to historic lows. It's about 15% or so now, or will be soon. And that is much, much lower than our competitors and much lower than where it was just a few years ago. And the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act was a bill that was unpopular with the public before it went into law, unpopular with the public after it went into law, and is limiting our ability to make these investments. That's a massive subversion of our political process if the will of the majority is not sort of working its way through the economy. And there's a lot of evidence that the reason that law and other things like that pass is that it has to do with the ways that economic polarization is affecting our politics. we also see this playing out in the ways that monopolies are using their power in the economy to affect the rules in the industries that they exist in. So making our markets not work the way a competitive market should. Finally, inequality constricts growth by distorting demand through its effects on both consumption and investment. So I already noted that there is evidence now that a lot of new research and evidence is showing that the rise in inequality, and particularly the rise in concentration across firms, is lowering investment in the United States. You're also seeing that the rise in wealth, which one might think would lead to more investment because there's all these rich people with all this money. In fact, there's a series of new papers that are showing actually that's not happening. The rise in wealth concentration, as it flows its way through the financial industry, is actually increasingly making its way into loans to households rather than loans to businesses or other sorts of financing for investment, which is both addressing the consumption effects and is also ultimately destabilizing and is not improving necessarily productivity. So that was a lot of economics. I'm going to just move on to just to concluding. So as we've gone through the research over the past few years and come to these conclusions, we've sort of thought about what are the really important policies that we need to do to address this. And it's a big list. We need to change the way that we enforce our antitrust provisions. We need to think about how we tax capital. We need to think about counterweights to concentrated economic power, whatever those are. But there's a lot of new ideas that just came out last week from the Clean Slate Agenda project that give people the right to bargain collectively and all the different ways that we want workers to have a voice at work and in our society. Those are just some ideas. But those are all big, very hard things. And I'm very glad today we're going to talk about measurement because I actually think there are very powerful ways we can update our measures that give people a sense that these kinds of conclusions that we're coming to are where we should be thinking about finding answers for our policy challenges. So we want to measure what matters. And we have been looking specifically at GDP at Equitable Growth. So this is just, and you don't need to read the little fine print here, that's not the point. If you just look at the little chart, the little orange here, this is what the Bureau of Economic Analysis, this is a copy of the report that they release each quarter when they give us the new data from the National Income and Product Accounts. And at the front, they have a little chart on what GDP is, because that's the headline. So when they release GDP, if you watch the news, or if you're in a hotel or you go to a gym or something and there's like 22 televisions, all the televisions will be like, oh, GDP was this or that. And there'll be all these people on the television telling you that it means something about the economy. And so they'll be talking about these numbers, right? And they'll be talking about this in the aggregate as though, and I showed you those numbers at the beginning, as though that meant something. We've been working with the BEA and with Congress to get the BEA to do something that would actually look like this. So instead of having these aggregate numbers, these boxes, you actually disaggregate it. So these show the gold is the bottom 40%, the blue is the middle 50%, the next 9%, and then this purple, or whatever color this is, mauve, is the top 1%. So instead of just saying, oh, well, growth was 3% in the second quarter of 2017, here it says, okay, well, growth was 3%, but of that, a full percentage point, so a third of it, went to the top 1%. So of the gains that our economy experienced in that time period, a third of them went to 1% of the people, right? If things were sort of being equitably distributed, the top 1% would get 1% of the growth, right? And if this was the 60s and 70s, they would have gotten less than 1% based on that chart that I showed you. But that's not what's happening. So imagine what those 22 television sets and all those talking heads would be discussing if they actually had to look at this instead of looking at this. So we would be having a very different conversation about economic performance that showed us, that connected the dots between the aggregate and what's happening to people all across the United States. I will end there. And I've gone on, probably too long.
Perfect. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
And now we get to go this way, I guess, because we have our little step here so nobody trips. Oh, Sapna's supposed to be? All right, sorry, I'm doing this in the wrong order.
And then we got it.
Okay, dang. All right. So thank you, that was fabulous. So now we get to have a little bit more of a conversation. And so I am just going to quickly mention who's joining us on the stage here. To my far left is Sapna Mehta, Director of Public Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative. And next to Sapna is Daniel Alpert, Managing Director at Westwood Capital. And Heather, and I'm Maureen Conway again. You have, biomaterials, so I don't want to belabor that. I'm going to sort of let them kind of introduce themselves as well, but do take a look at their bios because they're all quite accomplished. So you have that available to you. But Heather's just covered a lot of ground in a little time. Well done. So let's just kind of jump in. And Sapna, I'm going to start with you. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit briefly about Groundwork and sort of how Groundwork thinks about some of these issues of economic measurement. And also maybe just you could tell us a little bit about how you kind of came into this work and why you are kind of doing what you're doing. So Sapna, let me just let you start.
Yeah, so thank you, Maureen, and to the Economic Opportunities Program for having me here today. It's really great to be here with Heather and Dan. At Groundwork, we are dedicated to advancing a coherent, persuasive narrative around the economy. And our shorthand for this narrative is we are the economy. That means that everyday people, people of color, working people, folks with disabilities are at the center of our economy, and our economy is only working when it works for most of us. And when the economy is working for those who have been excluded or left behind, that's going to benefit everyone. And as Maureen mentioned earlier, the current data release landscape of unemployment, GDP, the stock market, these just aren't accurate measures of how most people are faring in the economy. And so at Groundwork, we're really interested in finding and developing new economic metrics that do a better job at capturing the human side of the economy. For me personally, I came into this work because both of my parents work in healthcare, and growing up in Northeast Ohio, I really saw what the lack of healthcare meant for families. Folks are wearing out their bodies, working 2 to 3 jobs, to put food on the table, to put their children through school, and they couldn't afford critical medications like insulin. They're forced to skip, critical checkups. If someone had an emergency, and they had to go to the ER, if they couldn't pay, the hospital then, could garnish their wages. And I saw that happen, and I saw how it devastated families. And it just didn't make sense to me at this, that in this country of supposed opportunity, that folks didn't, and they still don't, have access to quality, affordable health care. And that means that something is really wrong, with the way that our society and economy functions.
Great. Thank you, Sapna. And it's great. I really appreciate that story. And I also appreciate you sort of making the connection of sort of the quality of people's jobs to the quality of their lives. And it's a good lead in to sort of asking a question to Dan of, job quality is something that we've been grappling with in the Economic Opportunities Program for quite a while now. And so I'm just going to take a little moderator's privilege and make a plug, because we just yesterday opened a survey of sort of organizations working in communities, asking them about how they think about job quality and what kinds of things they might be doing to influence job quality in their community. as.pn/job quality survey if you are interested. But I was really just excited. I immediately had to sort of track Dan down when I sort of saw the introduction of the Job Quality Index and sort of say, wow, that's amazing. So before we get into the details of the Job Quality Index, though, maybe you could just tell us a little bit, what inspired you to sort of get into this and do this work?
Shameless plug, jobqualityindex.com.
There you go.
She did it, I can do it.
Of course.
So around about 2005, I was about 48 years old, 25 years, quarter century on Wall Street, and suddenly decided that I had absolutely no idea how business was being conducted. People were trading CDOs, creating ridiculous mortgage securities. I thought I had aged out and just didn't understand what was going on anymore. As it turned out, it wasn't me. It was them. So I started writing around 2007, and then worked for a number of years producing white papers on various subjects, large-scale macroeconomic analyses that actually, I think, pretty much came into the mainstream explaining what happened and how all that capital ended up going in the wrong places. And that, of course, led to a book, and that leads to other things. As you start to write more, you get more invitations to write. And one of the things that bothered me enormously in the early years of this so-called recovery is that we weren't seeing the type of rotation that we would typically see from low-wage, low-hour jobs into higher-paying jobs, and every other type of recovery, with the sole exception maybe of the 2000s, right? We would typically see, and especially a very severe recession, we would typically see a rotation period. It would take a few years, right? You'd create some aggregate demand, and that demand would filter through, and it would create better jobs. And this wasn't happening, and it was starting to really stump me. Now, I have to add one side thing, and that is that my general theory is that we have two forces in effect in the US economy and all advanced economies. One is a prevailing continuation of a 40-year austerity condition, which is politically induced. And the other one, sort of fortuitous, meaning having absolutely nothing to do with the other, is this massive emergence of the post-socialist economies and 3.5 billion people out there as an exogenous labor force, effectively devaluing domestic labor. So I started looking at the data, and I actually started monitoring it every month. And you don't have the tools that you need if you're doing a big project to do this on your own. And I started with a few sectors just to watch the data. And as it turned out, the low-wage, low-hour sectors continued to form more jobs, a lot more jobs, than what you would have expected. This led to the conclusion that we were kind of not only stuck in a rut, but we were moving into a completely different paradigm in which our economy was truly unable to generate the type of high-wage, high-hour jobs that we would have expected.
Great. Thank you. So, Heather, I just want to give you a chance here. I've asked them to sort of share a little bit both about their personal story as well as their organization. And I know you have a lot of personal passion around some economic justice work, and I'm just curious if there's a piece that you'd like to share about some of the things that drive you on a more personal level.
Well, I feel like I shared a little bit, but I think that just this, I think what is one of the things that I think is common across all of us up here on the stage today is a real hunger to understand what's happening and why our economy no longer delivers the way that it used to, and how it can deliver for people in a different way. And I think that we're sort of just sort of stepping back and noting that this is a question that people are asking all across the country, and it's both experts and also people on the ground. We've been working with economists and policy thought leaders, and we pulled together a group of thought leaders about maybe a little over a year ago now, about 25 folks, all sort of the sort of up and coming generation. And it was really striking to me how what happened during the financial crisis when these folks were getting out of school was really the driver for trying to understand what's happening and what went wrong. And I think it's also worthy of note that is also your driver, as you just described, to understanding what has happened. I think just one on a substantive point, not on a personal point, I do think it's interesting when you look at the research and evidence that that the financial crisis, although it might have felt like that was a tipping point in the economy, I think what we're learning from the research and evidence is that tipping point was actually put in place decades before, and the financial crisis was a symptom. And so both trying to understand what that particular cause was, but the other things that have shifted really since 1980, I think is where we need to be searching for answers. And I will end with a personal note that for me personally, I grew up in Washington State, and my dad was a machinist at the Everett Boeing plant where they made the Boeing 747s. And in the early 80s recession, myself and all the other little kids at my bus stop were laid off. And not the kids, their parents, not the children, their parents. But it felt that way. And as a little kid, I was really struck by how much power that firm had. And now I know as an economist that those years that I was sort of wondering, wow, what is going on, really were this tipping point in the economy. and you sort of trace the arc of how business has changed, how policy has changed. These are just questions that I think are they're so important to our well-being.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I love you started with that hunger to understand, because I think you all have been taking some innovative looks at things, and I think Sapna, some of the work you've been doing is really interesting. You've been doing this work on inflation inequality, which was sort of a new term for me, and maybe new to other folks here. So I was hoping you could just sort of tell us a little bit about sort of what inflation inequality is, and also, but why is it important? Like, how does that affect sort of other measures that we look at, like the poverty rate? Yeah.
So at Groundwork, we actually, we were looking at a paper commissioned by the Washington Center for Equitable Growth that found that prices rise more quickly for people at the bottom of the income distribution than at the top. And so that's a phenomenon known as inflation inequality. Because there is more money at the top, companies find it more profitable to actually compete for dollars at the top of the income distribution than at the bottom. And so this means that high-income households have more choices than low-income and low and middle-income households. So the idea that business competition and a competitive market are holding down prices is really more relevant to the experience of upper-income households than lower-income households. So, for example, one of the examples that actually the author of this paper gives is that in the case of craft beer, new varieties of craft beer are consistently being produced. And this increase in competition keeps inflation low for existing varieties of craft beer, while competition is more stable for mass-produced beer, like, I don't drink beer, like Budweiser, resulting in higher inflation for those products. And so I think at Groundwork, what we found particularly fascinating is that it's not just that inflation is not uniform across all income groups, but that income inequality is so high that it's the root cause. And so that means that we're underestimating the true levels of income inequality and poverty, since both are measured using uniform inflation rates that do not account for the faster price increases faced by low and middle income households. So we worked with Dr. Xavier Javarel, who's the original economist who wrote about inflation inequality, and research at the Columbia Center for Poverty and Social Policy to figure out what inflation and inflation inequality might mean for some of our most basic economic metrics. And so we found that adjusted for inflation and inflation inequality, there are at least 3.2 million more people in poverty in 2008 than the official metrics suggest. So that's more than the entire population of the state of Iowa. And household income for the bottom 20% declined by nearly 7% from 2004 to 2018, rather than the 1% decline as reported in the official statistics. So that means that income inequality between the top and the bottom quintiles grew by more than 20%, which is a more than 33% increase from the official statistics. And I guess, while incomes for low and middle income families declined, incomes for the rich continued to grow, right? So widening the gap between the rich and everyone else. And so at Groundwork, I think what kind of interested us is in this new data is that it tells a story about how low and middle income families are experiencing the economy, right? Because the economic inequality it's bad for our families, it's bad for our broader economy, because as Heather explained, right, economic growth has slowed. And so if the economy is not doing well, we are all not doing well, and the economy just can't be strong if all this wealth, continues to accrue at the top. We also know that this really resonates with working people. People know that they aren't receiving nominal wage increases, let alone a real wage increase. They know that things are getting more expensive while their wages remain stagnant. For example, I used to organize airport workers in Chicago, and I remember the baggage handlers hadn't seen a raise in 10 years. And theirs is not a unique story. It's happening, to working people in communities across the U.S. And I think this is something really tangible that also resonates with folks.
Great.
Yeah, can I? This is such an exciting study. Was one of our grantees early on, and I just wanted to point out one connection to a point that I made that might have been a little opaque for people who don't really think about the macroeconomy. because one of the really interesting things about this research is that it shows the ways, it helps you see the way that inequality is not just distorting how people are spending, but that is feeding its way through investment. And we have these stories in our head all the time about what's going to be good for the economy, right? And I think a lot of times we have in our imagination, we're sort of thinking of this shop down the street or something, right? The small business or something where it's like, oh, well, if we keep the costs low for that business, then they're just going to invest and then they'll hire more people, they'll keep those people on. That's a very, if you know anybody that owns a business, like these are basic, questions that people ask. And yet this research really underscores that that you have to think about not just those incentives in terms of costs, but what kinds of customers people are looking at. And so the economy has never been just this cost story, but it's hard to kind of put all that together in our head at one time. And I think that Yarabel's research and the work that Groundwork has done to elevate that really does show how the shift in who is buying things and what they can afford is affecting what firms are investing in and what they're making in ways that is having these multiplicative effects across our economy. And so I look forward to Groundwork helping us to make sense of that in ways that are just as pithy and just as easy as thinking of the shop down the street. But we need to and so part of how we need to change what measures is to reformulate that understanding.
Yeah, great, thank you. Dan, I want to come to you next so that you can sort of say a little bit more about the Job Quality Index and kind of give us an overview of that.
So, folks like myself and Heather and Savna, we think in quintiles, probably dream in deciles, right? And
Totally.
Yeah, and it's all very, very interesting from a research standpoint. But unfortunately, the people who are in the gym, the people you described who are looking at the television screens, and more importantly, people in the markets and people watching financial news and headline news and all the other news sources are not thinking that way. They do understand at some level that things aren't working. But at the end of the day, they think in headline numbers, right? And quite frankly, from the standpoint of the markets who you would think would be very, very, market participants who you would think would be very, very sophisticated and be able to look beyond these headline numbers, they're really not. And in fact, markets trade based on these very, very broad and undefined headline numbers. And so in fashioning the JQI, and we'll call it the JQI because Job Quality Index takes a long time to say, in fashioning the JQI, what we wanted to do is go beyond just creating a little grain of salt with which to take the other data, but actually create a mountain of Himalayan rock salt, right? to throw down and say, look, here's a new piece of easy to understand headline data. And this headline data will modify how you're thinking about the other data. It's a simple number. The Job Quality Index itself is really the ratio between jobs that are at the north side of the mean average weekly wage and jobs below that. And the answer, the spoiler alert, I guess, is that they've been declining for 30 years, not a big surprise. So, if you looked at a perfectly balanced economy where half the jobs were high quality and half the jobs were low quality, the JQI would have a reading of 100. And back in 1990, it had a reading of 95 plus. And today it has a reading in the low 80s. More importantly, it changes every single month. So we have a data point that we can put out in parallel with the jobs announcements. And by doing so, we can say, okay, well, that's really wonderful that we created X number of jobs or that the U3 unemployment rate is declined. But at the end of the day, look at the quality of the jobs that we're making. So we have two data points that we put out. One is the Job Quality Index itself, which is a long-term intertemporal analysis, going back 30 years. And the only reason that it's 30 years is that's when the data is available from. We'd love to be able to go back farther, but the data is not sufficient to do so. And it covers all production and non-supervisory workers. P&NS workers are about 83% of all workers. Doing so eliminates, first of all, we could only go back to 2000 if we covered all employees, but it not only gives us a broader time frame, but it also removes some of the skew that you would see from the very top 1% of earners who would be in the all employees number. But even within that reduced base of 83% production and non-supervisory workers, you've seen this massive degradation in quality. The second data point we put out is something called the JQ instant, which is a little bit of a, sexy look, shiny, bright, shiny object number, which is basically to say, okay, well, since we have 180 sectors in the job quality index, and we know which sectors are producing low quality jobs and which sectors are producing high quality jobs, we can look at the jobs formed that very month, that hour after the numbers come out, and say how many of them were in the sectors that are lousy and how many of them are in the sectors that were good. We call that the JQ instant. It's a very simple snapshot analysis of the total private sector jobs that were gained or lost in a period. And that number comes out. It's very, very digestible by the financial markets, as is the JQI. And that creates a little bit of dialogue over, okay, it's very nice that we created 110,000 jobs. But are those 110,000 jobs coming from the right place, or are they just really more low-wage, lower jobs? May I go on for just another minute?
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you actually
Sure.
on that, because you've been saying this low-wage, low-hour jobs things, and I know one of the things that was striking to me when we were talking about this is the focus on hours, right? Because I think a lot of our conversation is on wage rate. What's the
Right.
wage rate? What's the wage rate? And what you saw was a lot of the sort of driver of the degradation in quality is due to the reduction in hours, which
Yeah.
is really reducing
So,
people's income. And the other thing on that, I just want to give
Sure.
a shout out to my colleagues in the financial security program who, looking at this issue of hours, looked at also so it's not just fewer hours, but the less predictability of hours and the role of income volatility and sort of destabilizing people.
So with respect to hours worked, yes, we're looking at earnings. We're looking at weekly earnings. So obviously we're looking at wages times hours, right? And yes, that is a huge, huge change over the last 50 years. You had the average number of hours worked was, 50 years ago, about 33. And the cluster of hours was, maybe plus or minus 10% off of that. Today, depending on which sectors you're talking about, the lowest sector, which is leisure and hospitality, offers an average of 25 hours a week. Think about that, okay? By the way, those are also some of the lowest wage jobs, right? So this is an enormous sector, 14 million people. Forget the state of Ohio. This is a gigantic, or it wasn't Ohio. Iowa. Sorry. This is just an enormous cohort. If you look at 4 sectors in the economy, healthcare and social assistance, retail, administrative and waste services, and leisure and hospitality, those 4 sectors, the job growth in those 4 sectors equals, almost to the penny, the job loss in the manufacturing sector in America over the same period of time. And those 4 sectors are mammoth. And they have very low hours, and they offer very low wages.
Yeah. Great, thank you. So now I kind of want us to move into a little bit about, so what are existing systems? But I want to talk a little bit more about sort of, I want to talk a little bit about how things could be better utilized. Although actually, I think the question I was going to ask you, Heather, first before we get into this is really just to unpack a little bit more some of the inequality, because you've been highlighting sort of the unequal growth and sort of the degree to which the GDP, very starkly illustrates sort of where growth goes and where growth doesn't. But could you comment a little bit more on other ways in which that's divided? And I'm particularly thinking about sort of women, people of color, younger cohorts, sort of what has been the experience of them in terms of these inequality numbers? And if you could just unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, I think, one of the exciting things is that we have access to so much more data that allows us to disaggregate it and look at different demographics and look across place. I think it remains a little bit tough when you really want to slice and dice it too small. You can't do all the things you want to do because we just don't have the capacity. But the trends tend to confirm one's priors, that who's doing well and who is not. But in my slides, I feel like as I'm talking about the economy, I'm constantly sort of emphasizing that we need to disaggregate it, and then I'm not showing slides that break it down for all the different demographic groups. I'm looking across income groups, sort of knowing that those income groups are composed of different kinds of people. And so that is sort of the next layer of iteration that we always need to keep at the forefront. One of the most exciting things that's been happening in economics, and if you follow the news coverage each January when the big econ conference happens, there's always a few articles about this in the days and weeks after. But over the past 3 to 5 years, there's been a lot of attention to the role of women and people of color within the profession. So this year was the 50th anniversary of the National Economics Association, which is sort of the traditional sort of Black economist professional organization inside the sort of the major umbrella of economists, and really thinking about inclusion, the lack thereof in economics has been a big theme. I could go on and on about it, but it does feel, I mean, there is a lot of, people are trying to make a lot of progress on that. And I say that because there's also actual research evidence that if you have different people doing economics, they ask different questions. I mean, there's evidence that the kinds of people that choose to do research on particular communities are different than those that study other things. And so the extent to which we have an economics profession that is much more diverse plays into our ability to do better policy, and it also plays into the kinds of research questions that are being asked. And so I just wanted to use this as a moment on the disaggregation that both, it's about the data, but it's also about making sure that we have space for that.
Just like who invents things, who's asking the questions is really important. That's really great. There was another follow-up question I was going to ask you, but I'll think of it later and come back to it. And Dan, because but I wanted to get that on the table because we do think a lot about these divides by race and gender and how important that is. And Dan, I kind of want to come to you and sort of say, in looking at job quality, right? It is, I get it's a big national measure, and you're kind of talking to a national audience that I gather is not, sort of looking at the fine details as often as we might hope they might be. But we also know, like across the country, sort of regional economies are different. And so I'm just curious sort of how you're thinking about how people might think about job quality in their area and what the index might say to that.
Yeah, so there's two cuts that we're looking at the data. One is regional and the other one is industry super sectors. We're right now, I'm working on a project in healthcare and social assistance to sort of demonstrate, and the answers, we already know the answer, but we need to do the numbers a little bit more heavily to demonstrate that the number within that super sector, the number of jobs has drifted towards the lower paying categories. Not surprisingly, hospitals have been staffing up with more and more lower paid workers doing tasks that could be mechanized, could be automated, could be made more efficient, but they don't want to invest the capital necessary to do so. So, and then the massive increase in the social assistance sector has also affected that. So looking at that, that's a very interesting analysis. Regionally, from just a pure quantitative side, if you did this with, say, California, you would have a very, very good, reliable number because of the diversity of the economy. It's not all concentrated in one industry, and because of the size of the economy. If you got down to try to do this in Rhode Island or Delaware, it's a meaningless number, to be quite honest. And so while and especially in any state, if I did, I haven't done it, but I'd be curious to do it in Washington State. It's so dominated by Boeing that well, maybe not anymore. But it historically has been that you would see this incredible skew relative to the rest of the country. So it's difficult, I think, at some level to look at this unless you have a very diversified large economy.
Okay. And Sapna, I want to come to you and just sort of ask you kind of two questions. One is, I know these issues of sort of race, gender, and place and how that influences things is something that you all think a lot. So if you want to comment on that, please do. But also, I'm just curious, sort of with this, your work on inflation inequality, kind of, are there further questions that you're trying to think about, or what's next as you start to think about how can this concept really be used more broadly?
Yeah, just to your first question, I think the mainstream narrative really says that the solution to wage gaps, occupational segregation by race and gender is for women, people of color to lean in, work harder, negotiate harder, and it puts the blame on the individual, right, instead of the systems of of power that are at play. But really, like if the most marginalized people are succeeding in our economy, not to sound like a broken record, but then our economy is not working, right? And when the economy centers the most marginalized, all of us benefit. And I think that, well, data is not everything, right? Because who is included in the data is also a function of power. The data is important, right? Because it helps elevate the scope of the systemic inequities and really surface that. And, to the extent that the measurement of a problem can lead to better solutions. And then just on the inflation inequality piece, I think that data does a great job of really backing up many of the things that we know to be true about how our economy works, like how systems work, how people's lives work, how systems and structures affect people's day to day. And so we, basically, right, like inequality is so bad that rich people are so rich that they're literally creating this two-tiered market structure that is hurting lower and middle income families. They have so much money that they don't know what to do with because they are taking it from the rest of us, right? And that's what's making our economy worse off. And so I think, it's not just that progressive policies are right morally, but they're also good for the economy, right? Like this data bolsters our argument that we do need to do things differently, and we have to talk about structural change and fundamentally change how our economy works. So at Groundwork, we are really focused on disabusing folks of the notion that the economy is great because the stock market, is doing well or GDP is high or even not so high. But the real question is well, how are real people doing, right? How is your family doing? How's my family doing? And that should be the measurement to really assess how if the economy is doing well. I think that was really our goal in digging into inflation inequality.
Yeah, great. So Heather, I want to close this up by asking with you about, so you described the distributed national accounts, and you said, wouldn't it be great if you're at the gym on your treadmill and they were talking about this picture rather than that picture, which I could relate to. I'd be like, okay, good. I wouldn't have to get off my treadmill and do something more interesting.
Yes.
But what does it take us to get there, right? What does it take to sort of change this conversation and to actually have government agencies put out something a little different?
Well, so we have been working on this for years.
Yes.
And we're really excited that a couple of months ago, the Bureau of Economic Analysis put a note up on their website saying that the pilot of this, not using national income, which is what we want, not releasing it on the same day as the national income and product accounts, which they have to do, but the pilot, the first cut, which will be released the day after the because they'll be using personal income, will be first launched in March.
Yay.
So so if you want to know about that, please feel free to give me or my colleague your email, and we will put you on our lists, and we can make sure that you are aware of that. So that's very exciting. Also, in the legislation that got through Congress at the end of the year that funded the government, there is $1 million that has been allocated to the Bureau of Economic Analysis to conduct this research. And it has been the case for for a while now. Congress has been now there's I'm going to get this slightly wrong, but there's various levels when Congress asks the statistical agencies to do something. There's some words that they use where they have to do it, and some words that they use it'd be really, really nice if you did this. And so they use the softer version of the words where they sort of encourage Congress, and then the BA has done this. So Congress has been just a wonderful partner, and people on the Hill have been incredibly excited. I've testified about this twice now, and both times there were the Republican witnesses also agreed that getting this kind of data would be a good thing. So it feels like something that really could generate some cross-team collaboration, shall we say. So we're very excited that we'll be having some of this soon. There's still more work to be done, but excited to have these first steps.
That's great. People don't always say Congress has been a terrific partner.
It's been just a real joy for us.
That is really great news. Well, I'm going to ask them one more sort of very quick round of, I'll ask them to be quick on this round and want to get you into the conversation. And if you're on Twitter, please, our hashtag is #TalkOpportunity, so tweet us questions as well. But I'm going to go to just sort of a quick few thoughts on how do different measures lead us to act differently. Dan, I'll start with you. And looking at the job quality index, sort of if you think about if people actually paid attention to it, what would people do differently? What would you want to see, say, policymakers do differently if they're tracking the job quality index?
Well, obviously the key is not more low-wage, low-hour jobs, right? There's been a lot of talk about minimum wage. There's been a lot of talk about pushing things up from below. The answer is more high-wage, high-hour jobs, right? And so we need policy to accommodate that. The simple answer is if the private sector is not going to create those jobs, which it hasn't been for many years, we need the other actor in our economy, which is the public sector, to do that. And the answer there traditionally has been infrastructure, but there are other answers as well. The idea of the public sector being a greater force in the economy to offset what has been a multi-decade history of government austerity is clearly the answer. I just want to say one other thing because it's not fair to my partners. This project was a multi-institutional project, which was a cooperation between Cornell University, where I'm a fellow and an adjunct, and it was led also by the Coalition for a Prosperous America, which is a bipartisan organization focused on manufacturing and labor, and also by the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. So I just wanted to get that out there, and jobqualityindex.com.
Great, great. Always good to thank our partners. Sapna, for you, what kind of policy change, kind of in brief, would best be addressed by would inflation and inequality take us to? Yeah.
So, I mean, I will talk a little bit about a rubric for evaluating policies that we've been thinking about at Groundwork. So an outsized amount of inequality means there's an outsized amount of power at the top. And so first off, our policies have to curb excessive concentrations of private power. Secondly, they have to expand public power and increase public investment, because the public sector is really the only, as Dan was alluding to, is really the only mechanism we have to do some of the foundational things like increasing worker productivity that the economy needs. And it's the only way that we can effectively check corrosive consequences of amassed private power. And then this third piece is also critical, is that policies have to be inclusive and equitable. We can't have an economy that's maybe just like a little bit less unequal than what we have now, but there's still like gender and racial disparities. And so I think if we're really thinking along these levels, policies that combat inequality should really do all of these things.
Great. And Heather, is there sort of, I know you have lots of policy ideas. So is there just one that you want to talk about that you hope a conversation around sort of distributed national accounts would make people think more seriously about this policy to address the issue?
Yeah, so I think that our hope is that, at the most important level, if you change the way, as you said in your opening, if you change the metric, you change what you're managing to. And so, and I think it's really important that whatever new metrics we want policymakers and the public to be watching, the reason that I like this disaggregated national, and I think there are other things that one could come up, but the reason that I think it's so powerful is it is a unique metric, and it connects the dots between our traditional ways of measuring economic progress and the things that happen to people and families. It provides us something that puts those into one metric together. So as an economist who's been doing sort of the public economics for decades now, there's some days where I talk about economics and I'm in some rooms and we're talking about very important things like the macroeconomy and we're using aggregate statistics, and rarely does anybody mention anything about people or families or different communities. And then there's other rooms that I'm in where we're talking about people and families and we want to know what's happening across race or gender, all these things. We have a jobs day where we have the unemployment data, but that's on a different day than the day when we talk about GDP and national income, because those are somehow disconnected. And I think what this indicator does is it's mind-blowing, because whoa, those are the same thing. Which you all have been saying they're the same thing, but we need to actually show people these are the same thing. And that opens up all sorts of new policy discussions, because then you really are going to say to government, well, okay, if you do something just to pick on the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, and there's so many fun policies, but just to pick on that one. So if you do that, and then, in the quarters after that, President Trump was saying, look, the economy is doing so good, growth is up. And we were sitting there going, well, yeah, but all that growth is going to dividends. It's all going to those at the very, very top. We need a metric that shows that to the American people so they don't have to read 12 different newspaper articles, but that we're putting that together in one coherent story. So my hope is that in doing that, people all across America will understand the economy in a different way. And we won't have to have two separate conversations. We have one conversation and bring men and women together, talk about the economy at the same time, all sorts of people.
Great, great. Thank you. So this is okay, great. So we do have people with microphones. So I'm going to go 1, 2, 3 right here, just down this little line. And I'll take 3 at once and then.
My name is Mike Golash. One of the metrics you seem to have left off, or I don't know if maybe you haven't talked about it today, is that unionization rates. If you look at unionization rates starting in 1950, compare them with today, there's been a steady downcline. And I think you can almost measure that as way also of a decline in real wages. And then there's second, even within those metrics, you look a little deeper and see the workers who have the right to strike as opposed to workers who do not. And that's a different metric also. And I think you'll see that those who do not have the right to strike will have a sharper decline. So I think, those type of metrics have to be made more public and thought about in a more clear way by people. So I'd just like to hear your comments on that.
Great, thank you. There's a gentleman, right there. Okay.
Thank you for your observations. I wonder if any of the panelists have looked at the data in the context of the developments post-World War I until 1945, because what you've described almost mirrors, mutatis mutandis, those events. The two questions I have in particular, the byline of the presentation was inequality constricts economy. And if in fact we're trending more in the direction of an inequality type of world, a la Mad Max and Thunderdome environment, we might very easily find that those who have had to live with inequality the longest can navigate in that environment far better than those who've been living with privilege and a perception of equality based on dollar signs. So my question is, do we have a way of finding out whether we're trending more in the direction of inequality or equality? And the second question I have is, as I was listening to all of you, in the background, in the back of my mind were images of Australia burning. And my question, and it was like I was looking at a micro weather event in the context of our conversation. Because if global climate change is not factored into all of these economic data, everything we're talking about becomes irrelevant in the next 10 years, if we can even make it that far. And I would like your observations to that as well. Thank you very much.
Okay, and now this one.
Thank you all. And actually, my question relates to the very last one that was asked. And in particular, I know, Heather, thank you so much for your work. But if you could speak to maybe if you've had a sense of the limits of addressing inequality from a lens of growth, in part grappling with climate and other questions, but also maybe in other regards, whether there's more to be said or opportunities to say more.
Okay, great. So we have unionization, we have historical periods, we have who can cope in an unequal world, or are we really going that way? And then the climate change, we kind of have a couple of questions related to climate change and inequality. So you want to start?
I'll start with the unionization question, speak a little bit about the second one.
No.
So clearly, unionization is a key factor in all of this, but I think underlying that, you need to look more broadly down to the political level. The states that are right-to-work states, right, which is obviously where the rubber meets the road in all this, are states in which you have a political consensus, or that political consensus has been accepted, meaning through the election of state legislators and so forth, that effectively deprives the unions of their ability to collectively bargain and organize. That factor, right, is a factor, in my opinion, and I think it's borne out by the data that we've done, that you have an increasing desperation for employment, right? People are willing to take whatever's fallen off the truck, so to speak. in terms of jobs. And the worse that condition gets in a given state, right? The worse the employment situation gets in a given state, the less there's a propensity to back unions. One thing I'll say about the job quality index particularly, but also just as a general point in terms of how to look at this world. A lot of people are very tempted, and I think the people up on this panel would agree with me, to look at everything from the standpoint of the worker. How are workers faring? How are families faring? All this. The Job Quality Index took a different approach. We actually wanted to look at the inventory of jobs on offer. Basically, what are employers giving us, right? And I think that's a very important distinction to make, because you can talk about how workers are doing, and it's certainly very, very important. You can talk about how much of the pie they're getting and so forth, but at the end of the day, it's all driven by what jobs are available, and that's what that's the work that we did, and I think it fits very beautifully with the other work that's been done by people on this stage.
Yeah, great. I really appreciate that point, because I think one of the things we've been thinking about also is to look at sort of what's on offer and how it changes, right? Because it's not, you can make different choices about how you design jobs as a company. Yeah. So, Sapna, you wanted to get in, and I know Heather wanted to get in too. So.
Just to build on that point, I mean, I do think, right, unionization is critical to strengthening job quality. We have to strengthen collective bargaining laws. Unions, while certainly not perfect and also have, a legacy of racism, really help to address racial disparities, right? Particularly improving outcomes for Black workers. So I think that's critical. I would just mention a couple other policies, like workplace policies, like paid sick days and paid family leave, right? That ensure working people don't have to make the impossible choice between, their or their family's health and their paycheck. Fair scheduling practices, as Maureen mentioned, to ensure that, everybody has stable, predictable schedules to ensure that they can, make ends meet and care for their families. And just updating, strengthening equal pay laws, anti-discrimination, and anti-harassment laws as well.
Well, and so I'll tackle this climate change, this climate question, or the couple of them. I mean, I think that this is a really important question. One thing that I believe, and this is something that we talk a lot about at my office, that if we want to in order to address the climate challenge, that's got to work through politics. And given what we know about the effects of economic inequality on political outcomes, that will require that we also deal with the inequality issue. That these are not, these are twin problems, they're not separate. And in many ways, I think many of the challenges that we see in the political process around these are the direct result of the rising economic inequality, the way that plays out. And there's a lot of there's political science research that connects the dots between these different pieces of the puzzle. So I think it's really important to start there. I think it's also important, as I've talked about these issues over the years at Equitable Growth, it's always good to get this question about, is growth the outcome? Is that what we're going for? Like, what are we going for? We really focus on the disaggregation of growth because it makes you ask that question without saying we're just going to go to a new metric of success. So it says, here's the metric you're looking at. It doesn't actually mean what you think it did, right? And it doesn't mean what it used to. That opens up all sorts of new places for us to have a national conversation about what it is that we're going for. And maybe down the line, we need a new metric of success. But, I was very, I've been in many, many conversations over the years, as I know many of you have been, about changing the government statistical, the measures that our government statistical agencies use. And what I've seen is that those are a really awesome full employment program for statisticians and economists and social scientists. And we get to go to a lot of conferences and we keep talking about it, and then we talk about it, and then we talk about it more, and then nothing, and then it's incredibly difficult to make them into law because there's all this path dependency, and there's always the opportunity for somebody to essentially concern troll. Well, I don't know if we change this metric. One of the things, I'm sorry, I'm just going to go off on a second on this, because one of the things about the disaggregating growth so GDP is a metric that we came up with nearly a century ago that is super flawed. There's all these problems with it. You know that metric is released and it is revised at least 5 times. And sometimes there's huge revisions. But nobody talks about that. It's totally fine. I'm like yelling here because it's so frustrating to me. As we've been talking about this new metric, like let's just disaggregate it, I got all these statisticians and I mean people that I love, wonderful people, but they're very concerned that if we add on the income distribution, they're concerned that we're going to have to revise it. Are you kidding me? Yes, you already revised this metric, but the new metrics, the metrics that connect the dots, are being held to a higher standard. And this is the thing, I feel like I've sat in gazillions of hours of my life have been spent in meetings where we talk about different metrics, and somebody is making perfect to the enemy of the good. The reason that I'm so excited about the work that we've been doing at Equitable Growth, and the reason we've devoted so many resources to it, is because we already have the data. Government already has the data. We already released this data in different forms. We're just putting it together. So it'll be much easier to get to that next level so that we can have the conversation that you are asking us to have. So it's like, how do you make those incremental steps that'll lead to the changes that you really need to see without, the Stiglitz Fitoussi Commission, that came out, a decade ago now, about changing, and incorporating climate change into GDP. Well, we in the United States haven't made progress, so let's find different ways. But I think that I'm so glad that somebody always brings that up, because what you are asking is the most important question. We all know that climate change, this is the existential crisis, but how we get through politics and the current economy to get there, that's what we're trying to help. That's our piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so this is what you all came for, right? People who can talk so passionately about economic statistics, right? And, sort of truth in advertising here, okay, this is why I love these people, right? Because I'm actually married to a research economist at the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics.
Oh, yeah.
So, I love this conversation. So anyway, I saw...
Sorry, Maureen, can I say, just to piggyback on what Heather said, right? So I think we've talked a lot about, the impact on institutions that are supposed to regulate our markets and constrain inequality. And I just think the idea of looking at different metrics for success is very interesting, because there may be some things that actually, should be outside markets. And I think that's where public power comes in.
I was going to recite a poem on night.
I want to take a couple of questions. So this woman here, and this woman here, and the gentleman way in the back. Okay.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Cosleon from Community Change. My question is for Heather. In the beginning of the panel, and first of all, thank you all so much for this very interesting conversation. At the beginning of the panel, you mentioned this impetus to try to understand why our economy doesn't deliver the way it used to. And I think for many communities of color, if you ask them, they would say our economy never delivered for them. And so my question is around this disaggregation of growth by income, whether your suggestion is also to disaggregate the data by race, by gender, by place, by educational attainment, and whether our economy is better or worse for women of color and people of color than it was 30, 40 years ago.
Okay. And one here.
Hi, my name's Elena. I'm a senior at AU, and I also am an intern at the Democracy Collaborative. I'm from a pretty small town in Georgia, and whenever I come back to DC, for whatever reason, I always get trapped in this kind of progressive bubble. And then when I return home, I try and talk to my family or my grandparents or a lot of just anyone who will listen. They immediately disagree. So I guess my question would be, how do you communicate these new emerging ideas to people who are stuck in the status quo and are closed off to new ideas like this?
Great question. Thank you.
Hi. There have been some critiques of things that measure the aggregate economy. And there are a lot of studies that say that immigration is a net plus for the aggregate economy, but then proponents of strict controls or reductions in immigration say that immigration has reduced the wages of a lot of Americans and increased inequality. So is there any, just from an economic perspective, is there any evidence on that?
Okay, so we have some questions on disaggregation, race and gender, the communications question to people who don't live and breathe this all the time, and immigration question.
Why don't we have Heather tackle the one that was for Heather?
Yeah, I'll start there. And So certainly, I mean, I think that, when I say it doesn't deliver the way it used to, showing those original charts where we were a nation that was growing together, and now we are a nation that is not, certainly is not. I did not disaggregate that particular chart by race and by gender. It's actually, that's from tax return data, so we actually can't do it with that. But we do know that, over the period, especially since the 1960s, there was more coming together, and a lot of that stopped in the 1990s or so for different demographic groups. So it is an important question to ask. It's also possible when the government does this disaggregated growth, it should be possible for them to disaggregate it by across place and for different demographic groups. But it's there's some methodological issues to work out, because the way that the academics who developed the idea did it, they connected the dots between the tax data and the National Income Products Account, and we don't have all of the demographic breakdowns in the tax data, although you do have regional. So some things are possible right now and some things aren't, but it's certainly something that people are talking about. I also think it's really important to continually, as we're thinking about the conversations around inclusion, to not lose sight of that, the third chart that I showed, that the vast majority of gains in our economy have been going to those at the very, very, very top. And that is really the most important. I mean, there's a lot of important statistics. There's a lot of important conversations you need to have about inequality. But the ways that incredibly high economic concentration of incomes is connected to the concentration across firms, is connected to the concentration across race, that is primarily a white group and disproportionately male in terms of the earners, is an important piece of the puzzle. But it's also just important to know how that's affecting our economy and how that's affecting communities and who's benefiting. But just one point on how we communicate it. I think, not to sort of belabor this, but I do think that the reason that I like thinking about starting from GDP is it's a measure that the people in your community already know about. So you're not asking them to come up with something new, but if you show them a different story about what that statistic means, if that's what's going to be on their news, if that's what's going to come up on their news feeds on social media, will that make people ask different questions? Because I mean, your experience, and I think many of us that come from families or go to places all across America, how you communicate means that a lot of time it is listening and helping people sort of hearing what they have to say, but helping them to see things in a different way through conversation. And so if you can give people new tools to do that allow us to start the conversation in a different place, that seems like at least one bite at the apple.
Great.
Can I tackle a couple of these? So with respect to immigration, and then I want to get back to Elena, who asked a great question. Yeah, sure, in a small enough region, it is possible to point to immigration as having some negative effects. Nationwide, it's almost impossible. There's no real convincing study that nationwide immigration is a threat to labor in general. What we have right now is a far larger threat, and that is something that I and others call virtual immigration. And virtual immigration really amounts to this massive exogenous workforce around the globe effectively taking the jobs of producing what we consume. So whether they're here or whether they're there, it is less of a factor than the fact that we have this massive excess of labor relative to aggregate demand for consumption. And the biggest problem isn't people coming across the border. It's the goods that are being shipped across the border that are the big problem. If I may have a moment to just address Elena.
Sure, because this is last comments.
Okay.
So.
Listen, talking to the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian side of this country is very, very difficult if you're a progressive. I've been doing it for a long time. I'm sorry, talking to the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian side of this country is difficult. It's been done before. It was done during the Great Depression. The first thing you have to do is start with, how you doing? And what do you think's wrong with this country, right? You can play from there. You don't have to stand there advocating progressive ideas. What you have to do is understand things from the standpoint of where they see the weaknesses. Then you can do what is, quite frankly, very difficult to do, which is to emphasize that government isn't the enemy, that government can actually help. And that's really how you address this. It was done by Franklin Delano Roosevelt with great effect. Keep in mind, you had a Democratic Party at that point that was fundamentally racist in the South. And yet they joined with progressives to restore this country. So don't feel like you have to sell the progressive idea, right? Talk to them, and talk to them from where they sit. Find out what they think is going wrong, and tell them that Ronald Reagan wasn't right when he said the 9 most scary words anyone ever said were, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Okay.
Sapna, do you want to share any final thoughts?
Just real quick, I want to the women from Community Change. I mean, right, we know the New Deal left out domestic workers, it left out farm workers, like Black and brown workers did not see the same like gains as their white counterparts during during that time. And so I do think it's critical. I mean, it's critical. I can't even think of a stronger word, right? Like race and gender have to be centered in our policy making. And then just like, I think one thing that continues to be an impediment in our ability to really move past a neoliberal economic framework is that framework really plays into the American mythology of what it takes to be successful, right? Like that narrative doesn't incorporate misogyny or racism or classism or power, all of which are very real in our society and economy. But and this narrative is very ingrained in people's minds. Even progressives, when they articulate how the economy works, fall into that framework. So it is tough, but I will say, from our polling and our message testing, we see that people do respond very positively to progressive policy, and even when you do center, race and gender. And so, I mean, I think it's going to be tough, but it's definitely, it's definitely doable.
Great, thank you. That's an optimistic point to end on. Thank you all so much, and let's thank our panel. I'm sorry we couldn't take all the questions, but really appreciate you being here. Join us again March 20th when we'll be talking about employee ownership and its potential to address racial and gender wealth gaps.
What a wonderful topic.